NASA Business Head Office, NASA BHO. For other uses, see NASA, disambiguation. National Aeronautics and Space Administration. A blue sphere with stars, a yellow planet with a white moon, a red chevron representing wings, and an orbiting spacecraft, surrounded by a white border with National Aeronautics and Space Administration USA in red letters. NASA seal. A blue sphere with stars, white letters NASA in Helvetica font, a red chevron representing wings, and an orbiting spacecraft. NASA meatball insignia. A red line forming stylized letters NASA. NASA worm logotype. NASA HQ building.jpg. NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C. Agency overview. Abbreviation NASA. Formed July 29, 1958, 63 years ago. Preceding agency. National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, 1915 to 1958. 1. Type Space Agency. Jurisdiction United States Federal Government. Headquarters Washington, D.C. 38 degrees 52-59 and 77 degrees 059 coordinates, 38 degrees 52-59 and 77 degrees 059 W. Motto for the benefit of all. 2. Administrator Bill Nelson. Deputy Administrator Pamela Melroy. Primary spaceports. John F. Kennedy Space Center, Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, Vandenberg Space Force Base. Owner United States. Employees 17,373, 2023. Annual budget increase $22.629 billion, 2024. Website nasa.gov. Part of a series on the United States Space Program. NASA logo.svg, United States Space Force logo.svg. NASA.s. Space Force. Human spaceflight programs. Robotic spaceflight programs. NASA Astronaut Corps. Spaceports. Space launch vehicles. National security space. Civil space. Commercial space industry. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA/NHS/, is an independent agency of the U.S. federal government responsible for the civilian space program, as well as aeronautics and space research. Note 1. NASA was established in 1958, succeeding the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA. The new agency was to have a distinctly civilian orientation, encouraging peaceful applications in space science. 789. Since its establishment, most U.S. space exploration efforts have been led by NASA, including the Apollo moon landing missions, the Skylab space station, and later the Space Shuttle. NASA is supporting the International Space Station and is overseeing the development of the Orion spacecraft, the Space Launch System, commercial crew vehicles, and the planned Lunar Gateway space station. The agency is also responsible for the Launch Services Program, which provides oversight of launch operations and countdown management for uncrewed NASA launches. NASA's science is focused on better understanding Earth through the Earth Observing System. 10. Advancing heliophysics through the efforts of the Science Mission Directorate's Heliophysics Research Program. 11. Exploring bodies throughout the solar system with advanced robotic spacecraft such as New Horizons. 12. And researching astrophysics topics, such as the Big Bang, through the great observatories and associated programs. 13. Contents. 1. History. 1.1 Creation. 1.1.1 Insignia. 1.2 Foundational Human Spaceflight. 1.2.1 X-15 Program, 1954 to 1968. 1.2.2 Project Mercury, 1958 to 1963. 1.2.3 Project Gemini, 1961 to 1966. 1.2.4 Project Apollo, 1960 to 1972. 1.2.5 Skylab, 1965 to 1979. 1.2.6 Apollo-Soyuz, 1972 to 1975. 2 Leadership. 3 Facilities. 3.1 Inherited from NACA. 3.2 Transferred from the Army. 3.3 Built by NASA. 4 Modern human spaceflight programs. 4.1 Space Shuttle Program, 1972 to 2011. 4.2 International Space Station, 1993 present. 4.3 Constellation Program, 2005 to 2010. 4.4 Commercial Crew Program, 2011 present. 4.5 Journey to Mars, 2010 to 2017. 4.6 Artemis Program, 2017 present. 5 Satellites, probes, rovers, launch vehicles. 5.1 Earth, Moon, and L2 point. 5.2 Inner Solar System, including Mars. 5.3 Outer Solar System. 6 Near-Earth Object Detection. 7 Research. 8 Environmental Impact. 9 Goals and Directives. 9.1 NASA Authorization Act of 2017. 9.2 Space Policy Directive 1. 9.3 Goals. 10 Budget. 11 Media. 11.1 NASA Cast. 11.2 NASA Edge. 11.2.1 Cast and Crew. 11.2.2 Reception. 11.2.3 Interactive Projects. 12 Miscellaneous. 12.1 NASA Advisory Council. 12.2 Use of the metric system. 12.3 Partnership with the United States Space Force. 12.4 Effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. 13 Gallery. 13.1 Observations. 13.2 Past and current spacecraft. 13.3 Planned spacecraft. 13.4 Concepts. 14 See also. 14.1 Articles about NASA. 14.2 Related agencies. 15 Explanatory notes. 16 References. 17 Sources. 18 Further reading. 19 External links. History. Creation. Main article, Creation of NASA. File NASA 60th How It All Began. Web. Short documentary about NASA. Beginning in 1946, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, began experimenting with rocket planes such as the supersonic Bell X-1. 14. In the early 1950s, there was challenge to launch an artificial satellite for the International Geophysical Year, 1957 to 1958. An effort for this was the American Project Vanguard. After the Soviet space program's launch of the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, on October 4, 1957, the attention of the United States turned toward its own fledgling space efforts. The U.S. Congress, alarmed by the perceived threat to national security and technological leadership, known as the Sputnik crisis, urged immediate and swift action. President Dwight D. Eisenhower counseled more deliberate measures. The result was a consensus that the White House forged among key interest groups, including scientists committed to basic research, the Pentagon, which had to match the Soviet military achievement, corporate America looking for new business, and a strong new trend in public opinion looking up to space exploration. 15. On January 12, 1958, NACA organized a special committee on space technology, headed by Guy Eifert Stever. 9. On January 14, 1958, NACA Director Hugh Dryden published a national research program for space technology, stating, 16. It is of great urgency and importance to our country both from consideration of our prestige as a nation as well as military necessity that this challenge, Sputnik, be met by an energetic program of research and development for the conquest of space, It is accordingly proposed that the scientific research be the responsibility of a national civilian agency. NACA is capable, by rapid extension and expansion of its effort, of providing leadership in space technology. 16. While this new federal agency would conduct all non-military space activity, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, was created in February 1958 to develop space technology for military application. 17. On July 29, 1958, Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, establishing NASA. When it began operations on October 1, 1958, NASA absorbed the 43-year-old NACA intact, its 8,000 employees, an annual budget of $100 million, 3 major research laboratories, Langley Aeronautical Laboratory, Ames Aeronautical Laboratory, and Lewis Flight Propulsion Laboratory, and 2 small test facilities. 18. Elements of the Army Ballistic Missile Agency and the United States Naval Research Laboratory were incorporated into NASA. A significant contributor to NASA's entry into the space race with the Soviet Union was the technology from the German rocket program led by Wernher von Braun, who was now working for the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, ABMA, which in turn incorporated the technology of American scientist Robert Goddard's earlier works. 19. Earlier research efforts within the U.S. Air Force. 18. And many of ARPA's early space programs were also transferred to NASA. 20. In December 1958, NASA gained control of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, a contractor facility operated by the California Institute of Technology. 18. Insignia. Main article, NASA Insignia. The NASA seal was approved by Eisenhower in 1959, and slightly modified by President John F. Kennedy in 1961. 2122. NASA's first logo was designed by the head of Lewis Research Reports Division, James Motorelli, as a simplification of the 1959 seal. 23. In 1975, the original logo was first dubbed the meatball to distinguish it from the newly designed worm logo which replaced it. The meatball returned to official use in 1992. 23. The worm was brought out of retirement in 2020 by Administrator Jim Bridenstine. 24. Foundational Human Spaceflight. X-15 Program, 1954 to 1968. Main article, North American X-15. X-15 in powered flight. NASA inherited NACA's X-15 experimental rocket-powered hypersonic research aircraft, developed in conjunction with the U.S. Air Force and Navy. 3 planes were built starting in 1955. The X-15 was drop-launched from the wing of one of 2 NASA Boeing B-52 Stratofortresses, NB-52A tail number 52003, and NB-52B, tail number 52008, known as the Balls 8. Release took place at an altitude of about 45,000 feet, 14 kilometers, and a speed of about 500 miles per hour, 805 kilometers per hour. 25. 12 pilots were selected for the program from the Air Force, Navy, and NACA. A total of 199 flights were made between June 1959 and December 1968, resulting in the official world record for the highest speed ever reached by a crude-powered aircraft, current as of 2014, and a maximum speed of Mach 6.72, 4,519 miles per hour, 7,273 kilometers per hour. 26. The altitude record for X-15 was 354,200 feet, 107.96 kilometers. 27. 8 of the pilots were awarded Air Force astronaut wings for flying above 260,000 feet, 80 kilometers, and 2 flights by Joseph A. Walker exceeded 100 kilometers, 330,000 feet, qualifying as space flight according to the International Aeronautical Federation. The X-15 program employed mechanical techniques used in the later crewed spaceflight programs, including reaction control system jets for controlling the orientation of a spacecraft, spacesuits, and horizon definition for navigation. 27. The re-entry and landing data collected were valuable to NASA for designing the Space Shuttle. 28. Project Mercury, 1958 to 1963. Main article, Project Mercury. L. Gordon Cooper, photographed by a slow-scan television camera aboard Faith 7, 1963. In 1958, NASA formed an engineering group, the Space Task Group, to manage their human spaceflight programs under the direction of Robert Guilroth. Their earliest programs were conducted under the pressure of the Cold War competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. NASA inherited the U.S. Air Force's Man in Space Soonest program, which considered many crude spacecraft designs ranging from rocket planes like the X-15, to small ballistic space capsules. 29. By 1958, the spaceplane concepts were eliminated in favor of the ballistic capsule. 30, and NASA renamed it Project Mercury. The first 7 astronauts were selected among candidates from the Navy, Air Force and Marine test pilot programs. On May 5, 1961, astronaut Alan Shepard became the first American in space aboard a capsule he named Freedom 7, launched on a Redstone booster on a 15-minute ballistic, suborbital flight. 31. John Glenn became the first American to be launched into orbit, on an Atlas launch vehicle on February 20, 1962, aboard Friendship 7. 32. Glenn completed 3 orbits, after which 3 more orbital flights were made, culminating in L. Gordon Cooper's 22-orbit flight Faith 7, May 15-16, 1963. 33. Katherine Johnson, Mary Jackson, and Dorothy Vaughan were 3 of the human computers doing calculations on trajectories during the space race. 34, 35, 36. Johnson was well known for doing trajectory calculations for John Glenn's mission in 1962, where she was running the same equations by hand that were being run on the computer. 34. Mercury's competition from the Soviet Union, USSR, was the single-pilot Vostok spacecraft. They sent the first man in space, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, into a single Earth orbit aboard Vostok 1 in April 1961, 1 month before Shepard's flight. 37. In August 1962, they achieved an almost 4-day record flight with Andrei Nikolaev aboard Vostok 3, and also conducted a concurrent Vostok 4 mission carrying Pavel Popovich. Project Gemini, 1961 to 1966. Main article, Project Gemini. Richard Gordon performs a spacewalk to attach a tether to the Agena target vehicle on Gemini 11, 1966. Based on studies to grow the Mercury spacecraft capabilities to long-duration flights, developing space rendezvous techniques, and precision Earth landing, Project Gemini was started as a 2-man program in 1961 to overcome the Soviets' lead and to support the Apollo crewed lunar landing program, adding extravehicular activity, EVA, and rendezvous and docking to its objectives. The first crewed Gemini flight, Gemini 3, was flown by Gus Grissom and John Young on March 23, 1965. 38. 9 missions followed in 1965 and 1966, demonstrating an endurance mission of nearly 14 days, rendezvous, docking, and practical EVA, and gathering medical data on the effects of weightlessness on humans. 39-40. Under the direction of Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, the USSR competed with Gemini by converting their Vostok spacecraft into a 2- or 3-man Voskhod. They succeeded in launching 2 crewed flights before Gemini's first flight, achieving a 3-cosmonaut flight in 1964 and the first EVA in 1965. After this, the program was cancelled, and Gemini caught up while spacecraft designer Sergei Korolev developed the Soyuz spacecraft, their answer to Apollo. Project Apollo, 1960 to 1972. Main article, Apollo Program. Buzz Aldrin on the Moon, 1969. The U.S. public's perception of the Soviet lead in the space race, by putting the first man into space, motivated President John F. Kennedy 41, to ask the Congress on May 25, 1961, to commit the federal government to a program to land a man on the Moon by the end of the 1960s, which effectively launched the Apollo program. 42. Apollo was one of the most expensive American scientific programs ever. It cost more than $20 billion in 1960s dollars 43, or an estimated $225 billion in present-day U.S. dollars. 44. In comparison, the Manhattan Project cost roughly $28.8 billion, accounting for inflation. 44-45. It used the Saturn rockets as launch vehicles, which were far bigger than the rockets built for previous projects. 46. The spacecraft was also bigger. It had two main parts, the Combined Command and Service Module, CSM, and the Apollo Lunar Module, LM. The LM was to be left on the Moon and only the Command Module, CM, containing the 3 astronauts would return to Earth. Note 2. The second crewed mission, Apollo 8, brought astronauts for the first time in a flight around the Moon in December 1968. 47. Shortly before, the Soviets had sent an uncrewed spacecraft around the Moon. 48. On the next 2 missions, docking maneuvers that were needed for the Moon landing were practiced. 49-50, and then finally the Moon landing was made on the Apollo 11 mission in July 1969. 51. The first person to walk on the Moon was Neil Armstrong, who was followed 19 minutes later by Buzz Aldrin, while Michael Collins orbited above. 5 subsequent Apollo missions also landed astronauts on the Moon, the last in December 1972. Throughout these 6 Apollo space flights, 12 men walked on the Moon. These missions returned a wealth of scientific data and 381.7 kilograms, 842 pounds, of lunar samples. Topics covered by experiments performed included soil mechanics, meteoroids, seismology, heat flow, lunar ranging, magnetic fields, and solar wind. 52 page needed. The Moon landing marked the end of the space race, and as a gesture, Armstrong mentioned mankind when he stepped down on the Moon. 53. Apollo set major milestones in human spaceflight. It stands alone in sending crewed missions beyond low Earth orbit, and landing humans on another celestial body. 54. Apollo 8 was the first crewed spacecraft to orbit another celestial body, while Apollo 17 marked the last moonwalk and the last crewed mission beyond low Earth orbit. The program spurred advances in many areas of technology peripheral to rocketry and crewed spaceflight, including avionics, telecommunications, and computers. Apollo sparked interest in many fields of engineering and left many physical facilities and machines developed for the program as landmarks. Many objects and artifacts from the program are on display at various locations throughout the world, notably at the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museums. Skylab, 1965 to 1979. Main article, Skylab. Skylab in 1974, seen from the departing Skylab 4 CSM. Skylab was the United States' first and only independently built space station. 55, conceived in 1965 as a workshop to be constructed in space from a spent Saturn IB upper stage, the 169,950 pounds, 77,088 kilograms, station was constructed on Earth and launched on May 14, 1973, atop the first 2 stages of a Saturn V, into a 235 nautical mile, 435 kilometers, orbit inclined at 50 degrees to the equator. Damaged during launch by the loss of its thermal protection and one electricity-generating solar panel, it was repaired to functionality by its first crew. It was occupied for a total of 171 days by 3 successive crews in 1973 and 1974. 55. It included a laboratory for studying the effects of microgravity, and a solar observatory. 55. NASA planned to have a space shuttle dock with it, and elevate Skylab to a higher safe altitude, but the shuttle was not ready for flight before Skylab's re-entry on July 11, 1979. 56. To reduce cost, NASA used one of the Saturn V rockets originally earmarked for a cancelled Apollo mission to launch the Skylab. Apollo spacecraft were used for transporting astronauts to and from the station. 3 three-man crews stayed aboard the station for periods of 28, 59, and 84 days. Skylab's habitable volume was 11,290 cubic feet, 320 cubic meters, which was 30.7 times bigger than that of the Apollo Command Module. 56. Apollo-Soyuz, 1972 to 1975. Main article: Apollo-Soyuz. Soviet and American crews with spacecraft model, 1975. On May 24, 1972, U.S. President Richard M. Nixon and Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin signed an agreement calling for a joint crewed space mission, and declaring intent for all future international crewed spacecraft to be capable of docking with each other. 57. This authorized the Apollo-Soyuz Test Project, ASTP, involving the rendezvous and docking in Earth orbit of a surplus Apollo Command and Service Module with a Soyuz spacecraft. The mission took place in July 1975. This was the last U.S. human spaceflight until the first orbital flight of the Space Shuttle in April 1981. 58. The mission included both joint and separate scientific experiments and provided useful engineering experience for future joint U.S.-Russian space flights, such as the Shuttle Mir Program 59, and the International Space Station. Leadership. Main article: List of administrators and deputy administrators of NASA. Administrator Bill Nelson. The agency's leader, NASA's administrator, is nominated by the President of the United States subject to the approval of the U.S. Senate, 60, and reports to him or her and serves as a senior space science advisor. Though space exploration is ostensibly nonpartisan, the appointee usually is associated with the president's political party, Democratic or Republican, and a new administrator is usually chosen when the presidency changes parties. The only exceptions to this have been Democrat Thomas O. Paine, acting administrator under Democrat Lyndon B. Johnson, stayed on while Republican Richard Nixon tried but failed to get one of his own choices to accept the job. Paine was confirmed by the Senate in March 1969 and served through September 1970. 61. Republican James C. Fletcher, appointed by Nixon and confirmed in April 1971, stayed through May 1977 into the term of Democrat Jimmy Carter. Daniel Goldin was appointed by Republican George H. W. Bush and stayed through the entire administration of Democrat Bill Clinton. Robert M. Lightfoot Jr., Associate Administrator under Democrat Barack Obama, was kept on as acting administrator by Republican Donald Trump until Trump's own choice, Jim Bridenstine, was confirmed in April 2018. 62. Steve Yurchik, Associate Administrator under Donald Trump, filled the administrator's chair until Democrat Joe Biden's nominee Bill Nelson was confirmed. 63. The first administrator was Dr. T. Keith Glann, appointed by Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower. During his term he brought together the disparate projects in American space development research. 64. The second administrator, James E. Webb, 1961 to 1968, appointed by President John F. Kennedy, was a Democrat who first publicly served under President Harry S. Truman. In order to implement the Apollo program to achieve Kennedy's moon landing goal by the end of the 1960s, Webb directed major management restructuring and facility expansion, establishing the Houston Manned Spacecraft, Johnson Center and the Florida Launch Operations, Kennedy Center. Capitalizing on Kennedy's legacy, President Lyndon Johnson kept continuity with the Apollo program by keeping Webb on when he succeeded Kennedy in November 1963. But Webb resigned in October 1968 before Apollo achieved its goal. Organizational structure of NASA, 2015. James Fletcher supervised early planning of the Space Shuttle program during his first term as administrator under President Nixon. 65, he was appointed for a second term as administrator from May 1986 through April 1989 by President Ronald Reagan to help the agency recover from the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. 66. Former astronaut Charles Bolden served as NASA's 12th administrator from July 2009 to January 20, 2017. 67. Bolden is one of 3 former astronauts who became NASA administrators, along with Richard H. Truly, served 1989 to 1992, and Frederick D. Gregory, acting, 2005. The agency's administration is located at NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and provides overall guidance and direction. 68. Except under exceptional circumstances, NASA civil service employees are required to be citizens of the United States. 69. Facilities. Main article, NASA facilities. This section needs additional citations for verification. Please help improve this article by adding citations to reliable sources. Unsourced material may be challenged and removed. July 2020, learn how and when to remove this template message. NASA logo at JPL on November 17, 2020. 70. NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C. provides overall guidance and political leadership to the agency's 10 field centers, through which all other facilities are administered. 71. 4 of these were inherited from NACA, 2 others were transferred from the Army, and NASA commissioned and built the other 4 itself shortly after its formation. Inherited from NACA. Langley Research Center, LaRC, located in Hampton, Virginia. LaRC focuses on aeronautical research, though the Apollo lunar lander was flight tested at the facility and a number of high-profile space missions have been planned and designed on-site. LaRC was the original home of the Space Task Group. 72. Ames Research Center, ARC, at Moffett Field was founded on December 20, 1939. The center was named after Joseph Sweetman Ames, a founding member of the NACA. ARC is one of NASA's 10 major field centers and is located in California's Silicon Valley. Historically, Ames was founded to do wind tunnel research on the aerodynamics of propeller-driven aircraft. However, it has expanded its role to doing research and technology in aeronautics, spaceflight, and information technology. It provides leadership in astrobiology, small satellites, robotic lunar exploration, intelligent, adaptive systems and thermal protection. George W. Lewis Research Center. The center's core competencies include air breathing and in-space propulsion and cryogenics, communications, power energy storage and conversion, microgravity sciences, and advanced materials. QL Dryden Flight Research Facility, AFRC, established by NACA before 1946 and located inside Edwards Air Force Base, is the home of the Shuttle Carrier Aircraft, SCA, a modified Boeing 747 designed to carry a Space Shuttle orbiter back to Kennedy Space Center after a landing at Edwards AFB. On January 16, 2014, the center was renamed in honor of Neil Armstrong, the first astronaut to walk on the Moon. 73-74. Langley Research Center. Ames Research Center. Wind tunnels. Transferred from the Army. The Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, located in the San Gabriel Valley area of Los Angeles County, California, is headquartered in the city of La Canada Flintridge 7576, with a Pasadena mailing address. JPL is managed by the nearby California Institute of Technology, Caltech. The laboratory's primary function is the construction and operation of robotic planetary spacecraft, though it also conducts Earth orbit and astronomy missions. It is also responsible for operating NASA's Deep Space Network. George C. Marshall Space Flight Center, MSFC, located on the Redstone Arsenal near Huntsville, Alabama, is one of NASA's largest centers. MSFC is where the Saturn V rocket and Space Lab were developed. Marshall is NASA's lead center for International Space Station, ISS, design and assembly, payloads and related crew training, and was the lead for Space Shuttle propulsion and its external tank. From December 1959, it contained the Launch Operations Directorate, which moved to Florida to become the Launch Operations Center on July 1, 1962. 77. Jet Propulsion Laboratory in La Canada, Flint Ridge, California. George C. Marshall Space Flight Center, Huntsville, Alabama. Built by NASA. The Goddard Institute for Space Studies of Columbia University in New York City. Goddard Space Flight Center, GSFC, located in Greenbelt, Maryland, was commissioned by NASA on March 1, 1959. It is the largest combined organization of scientists and engineers in the United States dedicated to increasing knowledge of the Earth, the solar system, and the universe via observations from space. GSFC is a major U.S. laboratory for developing and operating unmanned scientific spacecraft. GSFC also operates two spaceflight tracking and data acquisition networks, the Space Network and the Near-Earth Network, develops and maintains advanced space and Earth science data information systems, and develops satellite systems for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. External facilities of the GSFC include the Wallops Flight Facility, the Goddard Institute for Space Studies at Columbia University, and the Katherine Johnson Independent Verification and Validation Facility. John C. Stennis Space Center, originally the Mississippi Test Facility, is located in Hancock County, Mississippi, on the banks of the Pearl River at the Mississippi-Louisiana border. Commissioned on October 25, 1961, it was NASA's largest rocket engine test facility until the end of the Space Shuttle program. It is currently used for rocket testing by over 30 local, state, national, international, private, and public companies and agencies. It contains the NASA Shared Services Center. 78. Manned Spacecraft Center, MSC, is the NASA Center for Human Space Flight Training, Research and Flight Control. Created on November 1, 1961, the facility consists of a complex of 100 buildings constructed in 1962 to 1963 on 1,620 acres, 656 hectares, of land donated by Rice University in Houston, Texas. 79. The center grew out of the Space Task Group formed soon after the creation of NASA to coordinate the U.S. human spaceflight program. It is home to the United States Astronaut Corps and is responsible for training astronauts from the U.S. and its international partners, and includes the Christopher C. Kraft Jr. Mission Control Center. 79. The center was renamed in honor of the late U.S. President and Texas native Lyndon B. Johnson on February 19, 1973. 80-81. John F. Kennedy Space Center, KSC, located west of Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida, is one of the best-known NASA facilities. Named the Launch Operations Center at its creation on July 1, 1962, it was renamed in honor of the late U.S. President on November 29, 1963, 82-83, and has been the launch site for every United States human spaceflight since 1968. KSC continues to manage and operate unmanned rocket launch facilities for America's civilian space program from 3 pads at Cape Canaveral. Its Vehicle Assembly Building, VAB, is the 4th largest structure in the world by volume 84, and was the largest when completed in 1965. 85. A total of 13,100 people worked at the center as of 2011. Approximately 2,100 are employees of the federal government, the rest are contractors. 86. Subordinate facilities include the Wallops Flight Facility in Wallops Island, Virginia, the McCoud Assembly Facility in New Orleans, Louisiana, the White Sands Test Facility in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and Deep Space Network stations in Barstow, California, Madrid, Spain, and Canberra, Australia. Goddard Space Flight Center, Maryland. Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center in Houston. John F. Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Modern human spaceflight programs. Space Shuttle Program, 1972 to 2011. Main article, Space Shuttle Program. Launch of Space Shuttle Discovery at the start of SDS-120. The Space Shuttle became the major focus of NASA in the late 1970s and the 1980s. Originally planned as a frequently launchable, fully reusable vehicle, the design was changed to use an expendable external propellant tank to reduce development cost, and 4 Space Shuttle orbiters were built by 1985. The first to launch, Columbia, did so on April 12, 1981, the 20th anniversary of the first known human space flight. 87. Its major components were a spaceplane orbiter with an external fuel tank and 2 solid fuel launch rockets at its side. The external tank, which was bigger than the spacecraft itself, was the only major component that was not reused. The shuttle could orbit in altitudes of 185 to 643 kilometers, 115 to 400 miles 88, and carry a maximum payload, to low orbit, of 24,400 kilograms, 54,000 pounds. 89. Missions could last from 5 to 17 days and crews could be from 2 to 8 astronauts. 88. On 20 missions, 1983 to 1998, the Space Shuttle carried Spacelab, designed in cooperation with the European Space Agency, ESA. Spacelab was not designed for independent orbital flight, but remained in the shuttle's cargo bay as the astronauts entered and left it through an airlock. 90. On June 18, 1983, Sally Ride became the first American woman in space, on board the Space Shuttle Challenger STS-7 mission. 91. Another famous series of missions were the launch and later successful repair of the Hubble Space Telescope in 1990 and 1993, respectively. 92. In 1995, Russian-American interaction resumed with the shuttle Mir missions, 1995 to 1998. Once more an American vehicle docked with a Russian craft, this time a full-fledged space station. This cooperation has continued with Russia and the United States as 2 of the biggest partners in the largest space station built, the International Space Station, ISS. The strength of their cooperation on this project was even more evident when NASA began relying on Russian launch vehicles to service the ISS during the 2-year grounding of the shuttle fleet following the 2003 Space Shuttle Columbia disaster. The shuttle fleet lost 2 orbiters and 14 astronauts in 2 disasters, Challenger in 1986, and Columbia in 2003. 93. While the 1986 loss was mitigated by building the Space Shuttle Endeavour from replacement parts, NASA did not build another orbiter to replace the second loss. 93. NASA's Space Shuttle program had 135 missions when the program ended with the successful landing of the Space Shuttle Atlantis at the Kennedy Space Center on July 21, 2011. The program spanned 30 years with over 300 astronauts sent into space. 94. International Space Station, 1993 present. Main article, International Space Station. The International Space Station as seen from Space Shuttle Endeavour during STS-134. The International Space Station, ISS, combines NASA's Space Station Freedom project with the Soviet, Russian Mir 2 station, the European Columbus station, and the Japanese Kaibo Laboratory module. 95. NASA originally planned in the 1980s to develop Freedom alone, but U.S. budget constraints led to the merger of these projects into a single multinational program in 1993, managed by NASA, the Russian Federal Space Agency, RKA, the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, JAXA, the European Space Agency, ESA, and the Canadian Space Agency, CSA. 96-97, the station consists of pressurized modules, external trusses, solar arrays and other components, which were manufactured in various factories around the world, and have been launched by Russian Proton and Soyuz rockets, and the U.S. space shuttles. 95, the on-orbit assembly began in 1998, the completion of the U.S. orbital segment occurred in 2019 and the completion of the Russian orbital segment occurred in 2010, though there are some debates of whether new modules should be added in the segment. The ownership and use of the space station is established in intergovernmental treaties and agreements 98, which divide the station into two areas and allow Russia to retain full ownership of the Russian orbital segment, with the exception of Zarya, 99-100, with the U.S. orbital segment allocated between the other international partners. 98. Long-duration missions to the ISS are referred to as ISS expeditions. Expedition crew members typically spend approximately 6 months on the ISS. 101. The initial expedition crew size was 3, temporarily decreased to 2 following the Columbia disaster. Since May 2009, expedition crew size has been 6 crew members. 102. Crew size is expected to be increased to 7, the number the ISS was designed for, once the commercial crew program becomes operational. 103. The ISS has been continuously occupied for the past 21 years and 8 days, having exceeded the previous record held by Mir, and has been visited by astronauts and cosmonauts from 15 different nations. 104-105. The station can be seen from the Earth with the naked eye and, as of 2021, is the largest artificial satellite in Earth orbit with a mass and volume greater than that of any previous space station. 106. The Soyuz spacecraft delivers crew members, stays docked for their half-year-long missions and then returns them home. Several uncrewed cargo spacecraft provide service to the ISS. They are the Russian Progress spacecraft, which has done so since 2000, the European Automated Transfer Vehicle, ATV, since 2008, the Japanese H-2 Transfer Vehicle, HTV, since 2009, the SpaceX Dragon from 2012 until 2020, and the American Cygnus spacecraft since 2013. The Space Shuttle, before its retirement, was also used for cargo transfer and would often switch out expedition crew members, although it did not have the capability to remain docked for the duration of their stay. Until another U.S. crewed spacecraft is ready, crew members will travel to and from the International Space Station exclusively aboard the Soyuz. 107. The highest number of people occupying the ISS has been 13. This occurred 3 times during the late shuttle ISS assembly missions. 108. On March 29, 2019, the ISS was scheduled to have its first all-female spacewalk, but it was delayed. Jessica Meir and Christina Koch performed the first all-female spacewalk on October 18, as part of a lengthy series of upgrades to the ISS power systems and physics observatories. 109, 110, 111, the ISS program is expected to continue to 2030. 112. Constellation Program, 2005 to 2010. Main article, Constellation Program. Artists' rendering of Altair lander landed on the Moon. While the Space Shuttle program was still suspended after the loss of Columbia, President George W. Bush announced the vision for space exploration, including the retirement of the Space Shuttle after completing the International Space Station. The plan was enacted into law by the NASA Authorization Act of 2005 and directs NASA to develop and launch the Crew Exploration Vehicle, later called Orion, by 2010, return Americans to the Moon by 2020, land on Mars as feasible, repair the Hubble Space Telescope, and continue scientific investigation through robotic solar system exploration, human presence on the ISS, Earth observation, and astrophysics research. The crewed exploration goals prompted NASA's Constellation program. 113. On December 4, 2006, NASA announced it was planning a permanent moon base. 114. The goal was to start building the moon base by 2020, and by 2024, have a fully functional base that would allow for crew rotations and in situ resource utilization. However, in 2009, the Augustine Committee found the program to be on an unsustainable trajectory. 115. In February 2010, President Barack Obama's administration proposed eliminating public funds for it. 116. Commercial Crew Program, 2011-present. This section is an excerpt from Commercial Crew Program. Edit. NASA Commercial Crew Program logo, cropped. SVG. The Crew Dragon, left, approaching the ISS. Starliner, right, being stacked for testing. The Commercial Crew Program, CCP, provides commercially operated crew transportation service to and from the International Space Station, ISS, under contract to NASA, conducting crew rotations between the expeditions of the International Space Station program. American aerospace manufacturer SpaceX began providing service in 2020, using the Crew Dragon spacecraft, and Boeing will also join when its Boeing Starliner spacecraft becomes operational in 2023. The spacecraft are owned and operated by the vendor, and crew transportation is provided to NASA as a commercial service. Each mission sends up to 4 astronauts to the ISS, with an option for a 5th passenger available. Operational flights occur approximately once every 6 months for missions that last for approximately 6 months. A spacecraft remains docked to the ISS during its mission, and missions usually overlap by at least a few days. Between the retirement of the Space Shuttle in 2011 and the first operational CCP mission in 2020, NASA relied on the Soyuz program to transport its astronauts to the ISS. A Crew Dragon spacecraft is launched to space atop a Falcon 9 Block 5 launch vehicle, and the capsule returns to Earth via splashdown in the Atlantic Ocean. The program's first operational mission, SpaceX Crew 1, launched on November 16, 2020. Boeing Starliner spacecraft will participate after its final test flight, launched atop an Atlas VN-22 or Vulcan Centaur launch vehicle. Instead of a splashdown, a Starliner capsule will return on land with airbags at one of 4 designated sites in the western United States. Development of the Commercial Crew Program began in 2011 as NASA shifted from internal development of crewed vehicles to perform ISS crew rotation to commercial industry development of transport to the ISS. A series of open competitions over the following 2 years saw successful bids from Boeing, Blue Origin, Sierra Nevada, and SpaceX to develop proposals for ISS crew transport vehicles. In 2014, NASA awarded separate fixed-price contracts to Boeing and SpaceX to develop their respective systems and to fly astronauts to the ISS. Each contract required 4 successful demonstrations to achieve human rating for the system: pad abort, uncrewed orbital test, launch abort, and crewed orbital test. Operational missions were initially planned to begin in 2017, but delays required NASA to purchase additional seats on Soyuz spacecraft up to Soyuz MS-17. Journey to Mars, 2010 to 2017. President Obama's plan was to develop American private spaceflight capabilities to get astronauts to the International Space Station, replace Russian Soyuz capsules, and use Orion capsules for ISS emergency escape purposes. During a speech at the Kennedy Space Center on April 15, 2010, Obama proposed a new heavy lift vehicle, HLV, to replace the formerly planned Ares V. 117. In his speech, Obama called for a crewed mission to an asteroid as soon as 2025, and a crewed mission to Mars orbit by the mid-2030s. 117. The NASA Authorization Act of 2010 was passed by Congress and signed into law on October 11, 2010. 118. The act officially cancelled the Constellation program. 118. The NASA Authorization Act of 2010 required a newly designed HLV be chosen within 90 days of its passing. The launch vehicle was given the name Space Launch System. The new law also required the construction of a beyond low Earth orbit spacecraft. 119. The Orion spacecraft, which was being developed as part of the Constellation program, was chosen to fulfill this role. 120. The Space Launch System is planned to launch both Orion and other necessary hardware for missions beyond low Earth orbit. 121. The SLS is to be upgraded over time with more powerful versions. The initial capability of SLS is required to be able to lift 70 tons, 150,000 pounds, later 95 tons or 209,000 pounds. Into LEO. It is then planned to be upgraded to 105 tons, 231,000 pounds, and then eventually to 130 tons, 290,000 pounds. 120-122. The Orion capsule first flew on Exploration Flight Test 1, EFT-1, an uncrewed test flight that was launched on December 5, 2014, atop a Delta IV Heavy rocket. 122. NASA undertook a feasibility study in 2012 and developed the Asteroid Redirect mission as an uncrewed mission to move a boulder-sized near-Earth asteroid, or boulder-sized chunk of a larger asteroid, into lunar orbit. The mission would demonstrate ion thruster technology, and develop techniques that could be used for planetary defense against an asteroid collision, as well as a cargo transport to Mars in support of a future human mission. The Moon-orbiting boulder might then later be visited by astronauts. The Asteroid Redirect mission was cancelled in 2017 as part of the FY 2018 NASA budget, the first one under President Donald Trump. 123. The Orion spacecraft conducted an uncrewed test launch on a Delta IV Heavy rocket in December 2014. 124. Artemis Program, 2017-present. Main article, Artemis Program. An arrowhead combined with a depiction of a translunar injection trajectory forms an A, with an Artemis wordmark printed underneath. Artemis Program logo. Since 2017, NASA's crewed spaceflight program has been the Artemis program, which involves the help of U.S. commercial spaceflight companies and international partners such as ESA, JAXA, and CSA. 125. The goal of this program is to land the first woman and the next man on the lunar South Pole region by 2024. Artemis would be the first step towards the long-term goal of establishing a sustainable presence on the Moon, laying the foundation for private companies to build a lunar economy, and eventually sending humans to Mars. The Orion Crew Exploration Vehicle was held over from the cancelled Constellation program for Artemis. Artemis 1 is the uncrewed initial launch of Space Launch System, SLS, that would also send an Orion spacecraft on a distant retrograde orbit, which, as of May 2020, is planned to launch no earlier than November 2021. 126. File Mars Exploration Zones. Web. Concepts for how the first human landing site on Mars might evolve over the course of multiple human expeditions. NASA's next major space initiative is to be the construction of the Lunar Gateway. This initiative is to involve the construction of a new space station, which will have many features in common with the current International Space Station, except that it will be in orbit about the Moon, instead of the Earth. 127. This space station will be designed primarily for non-continuous human habitation. The first tentative steps of returning to crewed lunar missions will be Artemis 2, which is to include the Orion Crew Module, propelled by the SLS, and is to launch in 2023. 125. This mission is to be a 10-day mission planned to briefly place a crew of 4 into a lunar flyby. 122. The construction of the gateway would begin with the proposed Artemis 3, which is planned to deliver a crew of 4 to lunar orbit along with the first modules of the gateway. This mission would last for up to 30 days. NASA plans to build full-scale deep space habitats such as the Lunar Gateway and the Nautilus X as part of its Next Space Technologies for Exploration Partnerships, Next Step, program. 128. In 2017, NASA was directed by the Congressional NASA Transition Authorization Act of 2017 to get humans to Mars orbit, or to the Martian surface, by the 2030s. 129-130. In September 2020, as a part of the Artemis program, NASA outlined a plan to send astronauts to the Moon by 2024. The astronauts are to travel in the Orion capsule, launched on the SLS rocket. 131. In February 2021, it was announced that Blue Ghost Lander, a robotic device being constructed in Cedar Park, Texas, will be sent to the Moon's Mare Crisium in 2023 to help prepare for NASA's goal of returning to the lunar surface. 132-133. Satellites, probes, rovers, launch vehicles. Main articles, list of NASA missions and list of uncrewed NASA missions. File NASA 60th What's Out There. Web. Video of many of the uncrewed missions used to explore the outer reaches of space. NASA has conducted many uncrewed and robotic spaceflight programs throughout its history. Uncrewed robotic programs launched the first American artificial satellites into Earth orbit for scientific and communications purposes, and sent scientific probes to explore the planets of the Solar System, starting with Venus and Mars, and including grand tours of the outer planets. More than 1,000 uncrewed missions have been designed to explore the Earth and the Solar System. 134. Earth, Moon, and L2 point. Besides exploration, communication satellites have also been launched by NASA. 135. The spacecraft have been launched directly from Earth or from orbiting space shuttles, which could either deploy the satellite itself, or with a rocket stage to take it farther. The first U.S. uncrewed satellite was Explorer 1, which started as an IBM/JPL project during the early part of the space race. It was launched in January 1958, 2 months after Sputnik. At the creation of NASA, the Explorer project was transferred to the agency and still continues to this day. Its missions have been focusing on the Earth and the Sun, measuring magnetic fields and the solar wind, among other aspects. 136. A more recent Earth satellite, not related to the Explorer program, was the Hubble Space Telescope, which was brought into orbit in 1990. 137. Cygnus and Cargo Dragon are used to resupply the International Space Station, ISS, as part of NASA's Commercial Resupply Services, CRS, program as of 2020. Cygnus is manufactured by Northrop Grumman and launched on the Antares rocket. Cargo Dragon is manufactured by SpaceX and launched on the Block 5 variant of Falcon 9. SpaceX Dragon, also launched on Falcon 9, was used to resupply the ISS from 2010 to 2020. The James Webb Space Telescope, JWST, is currently scheduled to launch in November 2021 on an Ariane 5 rocket. 138. It will be placed in a halo orbit circling the Sun-Earth L2 point. 139. Inner Solar System, including Mars. William H. Pickering, Center, JPL Director, President John F. Kennedy, Right. NASA Administrator James E. Webb, background, discussing the Mariner program, with a model presented. The Inner Solar System has been made the goal of at least 4 uncrewed programs. The first was Mariner in the 1960s and 1970s, which made multiple visits to Venus and Mars and one to Mercury. Probes launched under the Mariner program were also the first to make a planetary flyby, Mariner 2, to take the first pictures from another planet, Mariner 4, the first planetary orbiter, Mariner 9, and the first to make a gravity assist maneuver, Mariner 10. This is a technique where the satellite takes advantage of the gravity and velocity of planets to reach its destination. 140. The first successful landing on Mars was made by Viking 1 in 1976. 20 years later, a rover was landed on Mars by Mars Pathfinder. 141. On November 26, 2011, NASA's Mars Science Laboratory mission was successfully launched for Mars. Curiosity successfully landed on Mars on August 6, 2012, and subsequently began its search for evidence of past or present life on Mars. 142, 143, 144. On the horizon of NASA's plans is the MAVEN spacecraft as part of the Mars Scout program to study the atmosphere of Mars. 145. NASA's ongoing investigations include in-depth surveys of Mars, Perseverance and InSight. Outer Solar System. Outside Mars, Jupiter was first visited by Pioneer 10 in 1973. More than 20 years later, Galileo sent a probe into the planet's atmosphere, and became the first spacecraft to orbit the planet. 146. Pioneer 11 became the first spacecraft to visit Saturn in 1979, with Voyager 2 making the first, and so far only, visits to Uranus and Neptune in 1986 and 1989, respectively. The first spacecraft to leave the Solar System was Pioneer 10 in 1983. For a time it was the most distant spacecraft, but it has since been surpassed by both Voyager 1 and Voyager 2. 147. Pioneers 10 and 11 and both Voyager probes carry messages from the Earth to extraterrestrial life. 148-149. Communication can be difficult with deep space travel. For instance, it took about 3 hours for a radio signal to reach the New Horizons spacecraft when it was more than halfway to Pluto. 150. Contact with Pioneer 10 was lost in 2003. Both Voyager probes continue to operate as they explore the outer boundary between the Solar System and interstellar space. 151. The New Horizons mission to Pluto was launched in 2006 and successfully performed a flyby of Pluto on July 14, 2015. The probe received a gravity assist from Jupiter in February 2007, examining some of Jupiter's inner moons and testing onboard instruments during the flyby. Other active spacecraft are Juno for Jupiter and Dawn for the asteroid belt. NASA continued to support in situ exploration beyond the asteroid belt, including Pioneer and Voyager traverses into the